great honor to celebrate with you Richard Hart, and in particular here in a meeting organised by Caribbean Labour Solidarity. In 1974, Richard Hart, with Leslie Taylor, Lionel Jeffries, and other political refugees from the post-colonies of the English-speaking Caribbean created this organisation. And in fact, it's extraordinary that it has survived the passing of that generation. And now there are younger people who are living life. It is the greatest honor because Hart was one of the most remarkable people produced by our region. Richard Hart was born on the 13th of August 1917 in Montego Bay. When barely 21, he was central to the Organisation of Trade Unions, elected president of the Jamaica Government Railway Employees Union, and in 1938 was a founding member of the People's National Party. He edited at the same time a series of political newspapers, including the Jamaica Labour Weekly and Public Opinion. He was imprisoned as a subversive twice by the colonial government during the Second World War. After 1945, as the Secretary General of the Caribbean Labour Congress, he acquired a Caribbean-wide stature as the key individual linking trade unionists and nationalists from British Guyana to Belize. Tall, a charismatic platform orator, incisive in analysis, charming and persuasive in committee, a meticulous planner and a careful organizer, Hart was admired by his friends and feared by his rivals. An open Marxist from the 1940s, Hart became a target as the Cold War reached the Caribbean. In 1952, he was one of 4 expelled as communists from the PLP. It became impossible for him to make a living in Jamaica. In 1963, he went to British Guyana to become the editor of the Mirror, the organ of the then-ruling People's Progressive Party. That party, however, was under the attack of a covert campaign of the British and American intelligence agencies. And by 1964, Fort Gordon's PNC was in power. In 1965, Hart moved to Britain, where he spent most of the rest of his life, first in Surrey, while working as a local authority solicitor, then later at Stoke Newington and Bristol. He played a significant part in the life of Black Britain, speaking up and down the United Kingdom on history and politics, giving one large public lecture in 2007 on the 200th anniversary of the abolition of slave trade, on the eve of his 90th birthday. In 1982, he returned briefly to the Caribbean as Attorney General of the People's Revolutionary Government of Grenada. After the United States invasion in 1983, he returned to Britain. His published denunciation of the trial of the Grenada 17 as a travesty of justice led to Amnesty International taking up their cause. He was at the same time a prolific historian, a key figure in illuminating the role of slave resistance in ethnic slavery, and in charting the history of the politics of anti-colonialism in the 20th century Caribbean. He became lastly a student of the Arawak dialects of Guyana, and was one of the first scholarly students of Marcus Garvey. His life and work are woven profoundly in the 20th century political and intellectual history of the Caribbean and its diaspora. But it's also the greatest honor because this kind, generous, gentle, witty man played a key role in the life of my father and mother, and across the span of my own life. As I know is true of many of you, I think especially here is, I still feel his loss keenly. Richard Hart was a keeper of time. There was something apt that he chose to leave us on the morning of the 21st of December, 2013. For he was keenly attentive to the solar year, watching the cycle of the sun between equinox and solstice, as he suffered and survived his translation from Jamaica to Britain. He was alive to the history being made around him, his sense of the future ordering his struggle in the present, his sense of the present ordering his journeys into the past as a reader and writer. His attentiveness to the now is visible in his astonishing correspondence, the long letters he wrote to Cedric Belford, two of which I'll quote from in a moment, Harry Drayton, Neville Dawes, and many others, in which he carefully set out and analysed what was happening around him in Jamaica, Guyana, Grenada, and Britain, and elsewhere. It is visible too that in the shelf of quarto-sized diaries, which Hart filled with detailed notes of each day's events. It is measured in his meticulous collection of contemporary sources and documents. John Aarons, the former National Archivist of Jamaica, notes that without Hart's donated collections of pamphlets, speeches, handbills, and correspondence, the National Library of Jamaica would be as poor in materials for the early history of the PNP as it is on the early history of the BIT or the JLP, because there was no Richard Hart in the JLP who bothered to preserve the documentary trace. Hart kept his own archives and worked for weeks on end with documents, kept in what was then called the Public Record Office. So much so that his wife Davis joked in the 1980s that they'd have to put a bed for him in there. I thought I'd quote from a couple of his letters, just to give you a kind of flavor of the man. This is written, first of all, on the 7th of May 1972, Norton House, Rowley Drive, Cranley, Surrey. Dear Cedric, this is the said Cedric Belfridge in Mexico. By second cover, I'm sending you an off-print of my paper, Jamaica and Self-Determination, 1660 to 1970, published here recently in the Race. I tried to trace the changing attitudes to this concept over the period of the various social strata, and also how social strata have appeared with their own developing attitudes. Your criticisms in due course would be appreciated. My own criticism is that it contains no indication of the course of future developments I'd like to take. I end with the summary that years of unrelieved economic distress internally and increased knowledge of the course of events externally, particularly in Cuba, must inevitably combine to inspire new enthusiasm for the anti-imperialist concept in the 70s. Unfortunately, the present state of fragmentation and lack of inspiring leadership on the left gives me really little cause for confidence. You've no doubt heard of the sweeping electoral victory at the beginning of the year by the PNP in Jamaica, now led by N.W. Manley's son Michael. I do not expect a great deal from the new government, despite the ringing assurance I recently received from Michael in reply to my congratulatory note. For what it's worth, here's what he said. I promise on behalf of the government to try to keep faith with all the people of Jamaica. We firmly believe that with God's help and the hopes and ambitions that both you and the government have for our country will be realized. Perhaps, however, I should take some comfort from the fact that he does concede that my hopes for Jamaica are constructive rather than destructive. It goes on to describe the Black Power revolt in Trinidad and events in Guyana, where he describes the attack on the leaders of the movement against oppression, the attempt to kidnap Clyde Thomas, in which a policeman is alleged to have been involved, and the nearly successful attempt to assassinate Josh Ramsamy has been pretty serious. I'm talking on with my book on the part played by the slaves themselves in the abolition of slavery, and do believe it will be finished this year. Incidentally, my father's book, The Life of George William Gordon, has recently been published by the Institute of Jamaica. Next month he'll be 97. He's commenced writing his legal memoirs. He goes on with some personal information. He continues a year later, on the 23rd of September 1973. This, of course, is after the coup in Chile. Life moves on, scattering lessons in its path. The question is, do we pick them up? I can't believe that Salvador Allende lived and died in vain. But will our parliamentary socialists learn the lesson he so self-sacrificingly taught? He explored the parliamentary road under the optimum conditions and proved it unworkable. I doubt that he really believed he'd get away with it, but he knew that millions held on to the illusion that the parliamentary road was possible. So hopefully, that he decided to give his life in proving the matter conclusively, one way or the other. And he discusses British politics here, and then he switches to Guyana, where he's just met Miles Fitzpatrick, who's described to him in the course of the elections. From then on, the radio broadcast of the country went off the air. The army moved in swiftly and seized all the ballot boxes it was able to, shooting two polling station officers dead, who tried to prevent them taking the boxes from their stations. These boxes were taken to army headquarters, where the votes in them were destroyed and new votes stamped PNC put in to replace them. In the Rupununi, where because the voters are so scattered, the poll is usually as low as about 44%, the percentage rose to 98%. Almost all of these votes being for the PNC. He also writes about the emergence of the Black Liberating magazine in London, and again, on the progress of his book. But these letters collected are detailed analyses of the history that was taking place around him. Hart had a profound sense of himself as the product, agent, and witness of history. In this you may find the key to his prodigious and generous life, his strange mixture of patience and urgency, his resilience in the face of the many blows life threw at him, his will to be the heart of a heartless world. He carried within him two ideas of history which gave meaning to his life. The first was a sense of participation in a world historic moment in which, in his 20th century, that human majority who were the descendants of the survivors of centuries of ancient and modern slavery, the working people of the world, were now seizing control of their destiny. When we say that Vic was a Marxist, this is what we mean: that he believed he was part of a very long struggle to make this world into a place fit for human beings, to make a world of justice, peace, and solidarity, in which each person would have what they needed to live and develop their gifts. His confidence that this was the destiny of mankind gave him both a sense of urgency, a tireless will to work, and it gave him an enormous patience and a capacity to deal with challenges and reverses. This long view of history gave Hart to a gentleness in dealing with people who chose to be his enemies. As he said to my father, one should never say or do anything which might prevent some future rapprochement. He was confident that in time, those who attacked him would eventually see his point of view. And he was proven spectacularly right when Michael Manley, who in 1952 had been a key figure in the expulsion of the 4-H's from the PFP, 25 years later was welcoming Vic with open arms to be part of the making of democratic socialism. But Hart was also conscious of being part of a second world historical movement, and this was the struggle to overturn colonial domination. The confrontation of British colonialism was central to his political energies from the 1930s. And he was equally clear from the 1960s that the new threat to the sovereignty and freedom of the Caribbean came from the rising American empire. Colonialism, he understood, is deeply interwoven with capitalism, comprising interlinked regimes of political, economic, and cultural domination, which in his region meshed together the violence of race with the violence of class. He discovered that the most important organization of the PLP left, at which he was at the center in the 1940s, was a body called the Negro Education League, which recognized that confronting the intersection of race and class was the central task and vehicle of the national movement of the Caribbean. This is why Hart paid the keenest attention to Marcus Garvey, whom Hart met in London at Speaker's Corner 80 years ago this summer, placing Garvey's bust at the center of meetings of the People's Freedom Movement. Over the last decade, in the work of the historian Fred Cooper and others, there has emerged a peculiar argument that the turn to national sovereignty in the 1950s and 60s in Africa and elsewhere was a mistake, and it might have been better to wait and negotiate some prolonged federal arrangement with the colonial power. For some of Hart's contemporaries, such as Grantley Adams of Barbados, such an option was indeed, until quite late in the 1950s, attractive. But Hart was quite clear from 1945, when he proposed to the Caribbean Labour Congress that its goal should be full independence, that without national sovereignty, no other kind of progressive transformation would be possible. It is also true, however, that he did not see constitutional decolonization as an end in itself. He was keenly aware that an end of the colonial order, if it was not won by and for working people, might only mean the prolonging of those conditions of inequality for which the price, generation after generation, was shortened and stunted human lives, deformed human relations, and the withering of the promise of political democracy. In 1962, in Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago, and in 1966 in Guyana and Barbados, the Union Jack was taken down and replaced with new national flags. We usually take the end of empire in the Caribbean as that moment in the 1960s when these disunited fragments of the failed federation, under Bustamante, Williams, Burnham, and Barrow, joined the United Nations. It was a moment of almost universal pride, but it was also one of doubt and dissatisfaction. At the end of his book, Party Politics in the West Indies in 1962, C.L.R. James shone an ominous light. Dressed up in the lion's skin, independence clothes, our political publicists are quite unashamed and brazen. The king is dead, long live the king. Colonialism is dead, long live colonialism. For many, the changing of the flags at midnight had left in place the economic, social, and cultural order of the plantation colony. The Barbadian Commander Raffin, in his poem Negus in 1968, beat out percussive questions about the incompleteness of political independence in the Caribbean. It it is not, it is not, it is not, it is not, it is not enough, it is not enough to be free of the red, white, and blue of the dragon. It is not, it is not, it is not enough to be paused, to be whole, to be void, to be silent, to be semicolon, to be semicolony. Fling me the stone that will confound the void. Find me the rage and I will raise the colony. Fill me with words and I will blind your God. Attivons les pas, attivons les pas. Oubéis au moins, oubéis au moins. The new tropical kingdoms of Her Majesty Elizabeth II, but this indeed was their real constitutional status, appeared to many to protect a spiritual and material old regime. For Richard Hart, too, that constitutional end of empire was a bittersweet moment. He'd been a Jamaican and West Indian nationalist since he was 21, when he had thrown himself into the workers' movements which had arisen around the Caribbean region in the wake of Garveyism and the strikes and riots in the 1930s. But the independence he envisioned was one in which working people and their trade unions would hold the reins of power in the West Indian Federation. What we got, however, were nations in which political parties and unions were almost everywhere, subject to the control of strongmen, usually drawn from the educated middle class. What independence meant was a West Indian version of the Westminster system, in which democracy was reduced to party politics, often accompanied by communal violence and elected dictatorships, more or less benevolent. It was at best an incomplete realization of the hopes of the 1930s. Hart shared that sense of James, born almost 20 years before him, of Bratton and Lanning, born a decade after, and as of Walter Rodney and Morris Bishop, born another decade later, that the constitutional end of the British Empire in the Caribbean had not meant empire's end. In this season of 50th anniversaries, and on what is almost the centenary of the birth of Richard Hart, who was born, as we know, in 1917, we should reflect on his relationship with the end of the empire in the Caribbean. It was a historical turn in which he played an extraordinary role, first as a participant and maker of history, then as an archivist and researcher, and finally as its historian. Hart is quite unique in Caribbean history in being a figure who, like de Gaulle and Churchill, researched and wrote about the events in which he had played a key role. Neither Williams or Rodney, perhaps our most distinguished historians, ever had time to write much about the history they made and lived, and almost none of our other politicians have left us detailed archives and accounts of the events they experienced and shaped. Hart's most famous contribution as a historian is to the history of resistance to slavery, with W.B. Du Bois' Black Reconstruction, C.L.R. James's Black Jacobins, Eric Williams' Captains in Slavery, and Herbert Aptake's African American slave revolts. Hart's Slaves Who Abolished Slavery and the work which preceded that represents one of the first demonstrations of how slave resistance across the Americas settled the ending of African slavery. Hart delivered the fruits of his research in lectures on the streets of Kingston about the Welcome Maroons, Sam Sharp, and the rebels of 1831 and 1865. Eric Williams was an early admirer, publishing one of his essays, and Hart began the work which would result in the 2-volume The Slaves Who Abolished Slavery, published in 1980 and 1985. But Hart also left us 4 whole books in his own times, tracing the development of anti-colonial politics from the 1930s to the 1960s. Rise and Organize in 1989, Towards Decolonization of 1999, Time for a Change in 2004, and The End of Empire of 2006. These books are from one direction deeply autobiographical, punctuated by his eyewitness accounts and reminiscences, and from another serious works of scholarship, measured and stringent in tone, based on decades of research in the Public Record Office in London, and on a variety of carefully collected sources. These 4 books, brought together with Dick's many pamphlets on the history of labour and anti-colonial politics, and put into communication with the research of others, which Dick's work stimulated and supported, including Ken Post's Arise Ye Starvelings, Nigel Boland's On the March and the Politics of Labour in the British Caribbean, and Bobby Hill's prodigious work on the origins and development of the Marcus Garvey and Universal Legal Improvement Association, and with other recent research on the emergence of anti-colonial nationalisms and decolonisation, Put together with these, Dick's books point us towards a way of understanding the end of empire in the Caribbean, which is quite different to the narratives commonly in circulation. The classic popular understanding of the end of empire in the Caribbean is of a victorious campaign led by fathers of the nation, men like Manly, Bustamante, Adams, and Williams, who fought until Britain finally withdrew, handing over power to the people of independence. This narrative organized and flattered the big men of the post-colonies, erased a much longer, wider, and deeper history of struggle against colonial power in the Caribbean, erasing in particular the role of working people as the leaders of these leaders. It ignores how, unlike, say, in Ireland or India, the British actively lent their patronage to those figures, such as Bustamante or Adams, who showed they could keep the crowd from becoming too unruly. The unflattering truth in the English-speaking Caribbean is that we did not have an independent struggle to compare with those of India or Kenya or Ghana. And that when after 1945, and in particular the 1950s into the 1960s, the British conceded first universal suffrage, and then forms of responsible government, and then constitutional independence, they did so on their own terms. Only in British Guiana, where, for example, Rory Westnas, who died in February this year, and the national poet Martin Carter, in 1954 dynamited the statue of Queen Victoria outside the law courts, do we have the kind of uncompromising anti-colonial militancy of Ireland or India? Elsewhere, most nationalism in the British West Indies was made up of a mixture of working class demands for better wages and working conditions, and for a government which served them, and middle class demands for a fair share of the posts in the colonial administration of their own territories, including forms of home rule within the British Empire. From Cipriani to Butler to Marichaud Grenada, Roland Dominica, these were the parameters of struggle, for which a colonial constitutional order was an axiom. Hart, when just 30, heard Albert Gomes speaking on behalf of Trinidad at the Standing Closer Conference in Montego Bay in the following terms. Gomes said, "What we desire is a self-governing dominion. We in the West Indies want to graduate to self-government in the same way as Canada and Australia and all the others have graduated. We want to do it as part of the British Empire, sharing the good traditions and qualities which have made her the greatest power of the earth and the most civilized nation. One cannot imagine a near or Nairi speaking in such terms. Few are those like Richard Hart in Jamaica, or C.L.R. James and John LaRose in Trinidad, or U.C. Kwayana in Guyana, who dreamed of a socialist republicanism which would break once and for all the ties to Britain. And figures like these were systematically pushed to the margins by men like Norman Manley, Grantley Adams, and Eric Williams, who simply wanted command of their own state apparatus within the sphere of British dominance. Alexander Bustamante, in his speech in Montego Bay in 1947, had been quite candid about this. "I want to become governor of my colony," quote unquote. It might be said that almost every colonial premier and post-colonial West Indian prime minister wanted exactly such absolute power. What Hart argued made possible the rise of these big men of the moment of independence was the long history of struggle, first against slavery and then against the poverty and tyranny of the colonial order. If we were to look at one of the principal things driving his work as a historian, it was about bringing to public consciousness that long history of self-emancipation which preceded, if possible, the formal end of slavery. For Hart, as for Bobby Hill in his work on Garvey, as for Walter Rodney in The Making of the Ganges Working People, the first decade of the 20th century was crucial in constituting underground forces which would become visible in the interwar period and ascended in the 1930s. Hill showed, for example, that Garvey's first political education came in circa 1906 in the National Club of Jamaica, which, taking inspiration from Irish nationalism, published a newspaper called Our Own. Hart similarly explored the significance of the 1907 strike of the New Printers Union of Jamaica, in which Garvey participated. We're more generally beginning to see, across the global history of anti-colonialism, the importance of the span from 1900 to 1920, in particular in constituting the regional and diasporic solidarities of Pan-Asianism, Pan-Africanism, and Pan-Arabism, which in the 1920s would come connected to international socialism via the Comintern and the League Against Imperialism. We're similarly increasingly aware of the impact of the First World War on the Caribbean, of which Cipriani in Trinidad and Mary Shaw in Grenada were only the most conspicuous veterans in the birth of a new militant politics across the region, to which was added the political education given to those Jamaicans and Barbadians who, in traveling to build the Panama Canal and to work on the banana plantations of the United Fruit Company in Central America, on the sugar plantations of Cuba, and in the merchant marine of the United States and Britain, came into contact with Garveyism, trade unions, and the politics of socialism. In the late 1920s and early 30s, these men and women returned to their islands, bringing with them the ideologies and organizational culture they had acquired abroad. Veterans of Garveyism and of Cuban politics were key actors in the making of the grassroots of both the trade union movement and the political parties across the region, and indeed in the riots and strikes of the 1930s. To this we may add the quiet influence of Caribbean representatives of the Comintern, in particular from a distance, George Padmore, and on the ground, the Surinamese Otahuiswe. By the end of the Second World War, it was clear to Britain that it could not restrain the turbulent forces which were in motion. Far better to seek to contain them by ceding increasing authority to the right kind of nationalist leader. Looking from a distance, we might see that what we call decolonization emerged at the tension between demands for political inclusion and sovereignty, a revolt against the forms of objectification which were central to imperial domination, and demands for economic democracy, for a fairer sharing of land and the products of labor. The colonial power proved willing to make tactical retreats on all three fronts, but while most forcefully resisting change in either the economic order or the legal and institutional order. The crunch period came in the 1950s. In The Imperialism of Decolonization, their classic article of 1992, Robinson and Lewis argued that we need to understand the central place of the Cold War in ordering the process and pace of decolonization between 1945 and the 1960s. By the late 1950s, in the wake of the Belgian Conference and the Suez Crisis, competition with the USSR made the West move from a position of resisting nationalism to an attempt to co-opt cooperative leaders. The center of British and French grand strategy was the attempt to control the future through shaping the systems of government and political elites of the sovereign states which would emerge from the end of empire. What they could offer cooperative elites was local power and eventual constitutional sovereignty in exchange for clear solidarity with the West and for clearly crushing those more dangerous men and women. This is the context for Manley's expulsion of Hart, the Hill brothers, and Arthur Henry from the PNP in 1952, for the destruction of the Caribbean Labour Congress and its replacement with the more tame Caribbean Congress of Labour, for the removal of power of the PPP in British Guyana, and for the starving into emigration of people like Lionel Jeffreys, John Rose, and Richard Hart. The dangerous men and women were driven abroad, while at home, except for the OWTU in Trinidad, the turbulent energies of the working people were brought under tight discipline. There were other reasons why Britain and France in that post-war moment were willing to concede political sovereignty to a greater or lesser extent to colonies. Both countries were at that time building their welfare states. And if in the late 1940s, as per the French Act of Association of 1946, or the British Nationality Act of 1948, they had imagined a global British or French nation. When it came down to the practice of the 1950s, neither power wanted to pay the price involved in sharing their welfare states with their colonial citizens. And through capital transfers and accepting a diminished standard of living at home, achieving the full development of their co-citizens abroad. It was far simpler to grant independence and to ration transfers in directions which served Britain's interests in the form of aid, in order to receive which the post-colonial politicians would have to behave themselves. The unexpected consequence of this imposition, of course, of a global geography of inequality and welfare, was the waves of migration to the global north, which continue to this day. What was preserved in the passage to independence in the Caribbean was the absolute power of the crown. The Westminster model is traditionally understood as part of modern machinery of representative democracy. It's also a machine of despotism and oligarchy. At its centre was an actual or theoretical sovereign, with the royal prerogatives, as our friend Christina, May, translated into the powers of the executive and the party in power, even in republics where there was no formal crown. The crown, veiled behind the rituals of elections, provides, even in republics like Ghana and Trinidad, the essential continuity between the colonial and post-colonial Caribbean. The crown is not an innocent thing. It contains within it a naked absolutist claim of unbridled power and right, and the prerogative of violence. The massacre in Tivoli Gardens in 2010 is only the most recent example of the arbitrary right claimed by the crown in the Caribbean as elsewhere to kill its own citizens without any legal process, and yet within the law. Hart watched with fascination the rise after the 1960s of the process which I called elsewhere secondary decolonization, where women and men began to demand that political sovereignty, political democracy be joined to economic and cultural liberation. The two most important agents of this were the Black Power movement after 1968 and the proliferation of Rastafarianism across the Caribbean working class. The Greater Revolution in 1979 was an expression of both of these currents. The tragic end of that revolution was perhaps the greatest, most cruel shock and trauma in Hart's political life. If Hart was able to survive his expulsion from the PNP, the defeats of the People's Freedom Movement in Jamaica in the 1950s, in the face of the big enemies of the PNP and the JLP, the defeat of the PNP in Ghana in 1964, of Michael Manley in 1980, the murder of Rodney in 1980, and the collapse of the Greater Revolution in 1983. It was because he was confident that history was not over. He recognized that we were only at the beginning of the end of empire, at the beginning of the public history of democracy. As the last chapter of his book of 2006, of that title, The End of Empire, showed, it was clear that, to him that what we had seen in the region in the late 20th century was simply the replacement of British domination by American domination. But the slaves who ended slavery and the workers who ended colonialism were still in motion. The future of the Caribbean was still open, and in the long run, victory was not only possible, but necessary.
Thank you very much for that broad sweep of Caribbean history. I'm sure it was raised lots of questions, and the floor will be open for questions. I wonder how much the attitude, if I can ask the first question, how much the attitude of the leaders leading up towards independence played a role in undermining the whole push for federation that the British actually was behind at the time, and also how different are the attitudes today for some of those leaders in the Caribbean still?
Well, I think that for a whole generation of politicians, they had been given a taste of the fruits of office by the late 40s and early 50s. As they were allowed to occupy the post, the offices of Premier, and to enjoy the correct perquisites of government. And I think, therefore, the temptation for them to inherit the throne after the departure of the British was certainly a very great one. It's very striking, for example, how quickly Eric Williams moves in 1962, once he hears that Jamaica is becoming independent, with his infamous 1 from 10 leaves 0. One of the most curious details is that the date of Trinidad's independence was moved forward 2 months by the request of Williams, because he knew there was a meeting of the Commonwealth heads of government in the and he wanted to come to the meeting as a Prime Minister, not as the Premier. And I think that tells us a little bit about the kind of forms of personal humanity which were part of this particular term. But I think these men would not have been able to act in this way if they were operating in political parties which had a genuinely democratic character. But it was the characteristic of the political parties created in the Caribbean by the late 40s and early 50s that they essentially were parties which operated under the absolute command of whoever was the leading figure. The constitution of the BITU and in Jamaica, for example, said that Mr. Bustamante is president for life. Mr. Bustamante has the right to appoint a treasurer, a secretary, these other offices. So that in constitutional terms, this was organized like a sort of an elected of a kind of dictatorship. We may see here possibly the kind of profound legacies of that colonial order, in which you cannot expect the people who were produced by this system would instinctively want to have something profoundly different from what they had known. And I think that one of the things which gave comfort to Richard Hart is that he recognized that history had moved extraordinarily rapidly in the 20th century, and that if indeed there were strange reverses or places where history did not move so quickly, we should simply understand that this is things at least are beginning to move in the right direction. Davis and his family paid, because this was a very, very difficult road that he walked. Last Saturday, I was at an event which the Barbados High Commission organized to honor Barbadians who had lived in the UK. And there was a list of about 40 of us. I am Barbadian as well as the Guyanese by virtue of having grown up there. I was sat next to this person who I was curious about, and I discovered that she was the daughter, she's 82 years old, of an extraordinary man who many of you may know about, called Chris Hart, who in the 1920s and 30s was one of the important radical seamen. Chris Bartlett was a very close ally of George Patmore and C.L.R. James in IASB in the 1930s and was the center of the Seamen's Union. But in any event, she told me that when Bartlett died in 1946, the family was so poor that the children had to be split up and sent off to be raised in different homes because he was blacklisted and he could find no work. Now, what I think we need to recognize somebody like Richard Hart, coming from his particular social background as a lawyer, could have been an extremely successful corporate lawyer in Kingston. He could have had a very successful practice, making a lot of money doing property conveyancing and representing the interests of the rich. Instead, he chose a path which meant that he had very few paying clients past a certain stage, and he coming to Guyana, he was to make a very long story short, he was not treated very well by the PPP in 1965, and he was not. He didn't complain, but and they of course were under difficult circumstances, but he was not treated particularly well. He left Guyana with less than what he brought to it. And of course then he had this experience of an attempt to return home to Jamaica where boxes of books were stolen from the back of the truck. God knows what happened to them, and the experience of Grenada. Of that having to escape from what was actually the threat of death. So, I mean, this is, I think he lost a considerable amount in material terms. He did so quite without complaining about it. And these are, you think of someone like Walter Rodney was unemployed. He had difficulty feeding his family. In that period of the early 70s. So these sacrifices these people made are not just emotional, psychological ones, but profoundly material ones. Thank you.
I think it's more of a statement than a question. Really first to give thanks and praise to Caribbean Labor Solidarity for giving us the opportunity to remember and honor this real giant of a man. I'd like to give thanks and praises for you, Professor Drayton, for a very astute and comprehensive paper. Thank you very much. And really, taking the clue from UC Folk, just to kind of tell my own little story. I have to apologize because your paper just made me drift off and just start thinking about Richard Hart, actually. I kept having these memories. And one of them was, he taught a course in Hackney on history of the Caribbean. And I was there, it was like a community center. It was cold, it was wet, it wasn't particularly well endowed or anything. And what I remembered was this man, this huge intellect, this man of such great experience. Not a lot of people there. He taught this course with such attentiveness, and you could feel it was, and you could feel his love for what he was doing. You could feel his respect for this set of community people who were not intellectuals, who were not even into politics. And for me, the irony of seeing this man who in America could have passed for white, talking to us about the importance of Marcus Garvey, I felt so grateful. Every time I was in his presence, I had this sense that this is someone sent here. I'm going with you on the spirituality. I'm not going to agree with it. Okay, so you on that. Okay. He did his work here. He did it well. He did it with compassion. And what I loved about him was that he just had all the politics right on. But there are political people who do not have beautiful spirits. He had a beautiful spirit. He had a beautiful spirit. So thanks and praise for the brother.
We'll just take one or two questions now, then we'll have a short break. We'll come for a break, and so who didn't get a chance to get some food, we'll get a chance to look at the books. We'll look at a 10-minute break, and we'll come back with
There's a lady.
I'd
like to just compliment what Mr. McKay said about Hart. It's a wonderful person, and I had the pleasure of meeting. The thing I'd like to raise with you, Professor Drayton, is that you mentioned Tivoli Gardens not being represented because the Queen is still the head of the Privy Council in the Commonwealth. Can you hear me?
Yes.
That Tivoli Gardens was not represented at the Privy Council, but if they didn't have legal representation as such, how could they have gone to the Privy Council as the last port of appeal? And another question, I know that Portia Simpson wants to get rid of the Queen and change the constitution of Jamaica. And that the whole thing is that the Privy Council will no longer be the court of final appeal. At CCR, Caribbean Court of Justice, CCJ, will take over. What do you think of that?
First of all, I may have spoken a bit fast, but I didn't actually say anything about the Privy Council. What I said was that the Jamaican state, when it sent in its army with shoot to kill instructions into Tivoli Gardens, did so because it was exercising the Crown prerogative. And it was doing so because Jamaica is a monarchy, in which the Prime Minister, as head of state, Prime Minister as a senior elected person, and as the Queen's Chief Minister, has the right to use the authority of the Crown, which is an absolute power in a situation of national crisis over life and death. So I'm talking really about the kind of power that's concentrated in the state, which is part of the royal prerogative.
Okay.
As for your second question, I think that's a subject that's very dear to me, that it's absolutely clear that it is absolutely ridiculous that the Caribbean has not half a century after its independence attempted to begin to make itself part of its, at the center of its own system of jurisprudence. And the Caribbean Court of Justice is a very successful court. The countries which have stayed out of it, in terms of major countries, are Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago. In the case of Trinidad, that has partly to do with the anxieties of Indo-Trinidadians that the court might subordinate them to judges who who would not understand their particular situation, whereas they assume that they will have a fairer court coming to London. That's historically been the view, but I expect that will change. In the case of Jamaica, I think it's a mixture of the fact that I think the lawyers make a lot of money going to the Privy Council, and also the fact that the Privy Council has had quite a significant role to play in Jamaica's legal evolution. But I think that Jamaica itself, my understanding when I was at the conference of the Caribbean Association of Judges in September last year in Montego Bay, and I got the sense, of course this was before the elections, that there was a move towards Jamaica eventually joining the CCJ. I suspect that may be delayed for a little while since the government has changed.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we had one question at the top there from Patrick.
Two questions. I had the privilege of meeting with Hart quite a few times. There used to be a group of guys who used to meet in the pub in Stoke Newington once a month for a drink, and he would give his history of the Caribbean in a way that is about intergenerational learning. And when you go to the Caribbean, you don't have a historical perspective of the 20s and 30s, it's almost like the here and now. And what's your observation around the role of history being taught in schools and at the university around the 20s and 30s? And the second point is I'm reading a biography on Michael Manley, which just came out quite recently. It's interesting to know what's your take on what Richard Hart's perspective was Michael Manley in the 70s as he's trying to embrace democratic socialism, his links with Castro, and then by the 1980s, he was basically more or less subservient to the US.
Those are two very different kinds of questions. I think if I have understood the first question right, it was a question about the problem we have in creating a living sense of history among a younger generation that is in many ways increasingly cut off from a sense of historical consciousness. I think that's a profound problem in every country in the world, in the world at the moment, and it's partly produced by the engines of entertainment, which create this kind of relationship to whatever's happening now. So, when I spoke a couple of weeks ago about Walter Rodney, I began by saying that if you were to take 100 people of African descent in the world and ask them who is Walter Rodney, you'd be lucky if you got one person who knew who Walter Rodney was. But if you took the same 100 people and asked them who Kanye West was, you would find that the number would tend certainly above 95, if not to 100. And that's indicative of precisely the problem you're describing. It's difficult to be clear how that can be changed. I can't offer a strategy except to say that people often turn to history and when they themselves are involved in struggles of one sort or another. And I think that what is extraordinary about the last few years in Britain is that we've seen the emergence, as in the 1960s, of a group of young people who have been pressing universities all across the United Kingdom about their curriculum and about what is called in the 21st century the decolonization of the curriculum. And these young people are themselves in universities across the country, Manchester, Oxford, UCL, Warwick. They themselves are asking questions about previous generations. And it is in the midst of this particular moment, if we work with these young people, that they become actively involved in claiming that past. Your second question about Michael Manley, I I think that Richard Hart had a very generous and positive view of Michael Manley when he wrote about him towards the end of his life. And if you look at the section in The End of Empire in 2006, he says, you know, if we were to assess Michael Manley government, then there are some important remaining achievements of that period, including the kind of restoration of civil liberties of certain kinds to Jamaicans, and the ending of a certain kind of institutionalized anti-socialism, anti-communism, anti-Pan-Africanism that was part of the political life of the JLP in the late 1960s. So something was changed by that Manley period. I mean, he himself was somewhat dismayed by Manley's reversals in the mid to late 1980s. But you know, he was very forgiving, and he argued that, well, Manley was ultimately a politician, and he was attempting to take up a position which he thought would meet with the support of the majority of the Jamaican people, instead of attempting to do as he did in the 1970s, to be ahead of the Jamaican people, and that he understood Manley as being in some way chastened by that earlier experience, as much as he felt, I think, somewhat disappointed by him.
I think one of Michael Manley's positive legacies is probably how he instilled a sense of pride in a lot of younger Jamaicans at the time, where he was encouraging them to say, you can grow your own, you can build your own, you can do your own, you don't need to be importing all this stuff from America, which is not good for us anyway. This is what he was saying to people, and I think they did have a stronger sense of pride in Africans, Jamaicans especially. Can we have one more question from two more from first? I think it's you and Mike. Yes. Sorry, Ray, but the gentleman behind you first.
Thank you very much for that very nice presentation. My father, Buzz Johnson, was publisher of...
What was it?
Buzz Johnson.
Oh, Buzz, of course, I know Buzz, yes.
Yeah. My question is that Richard seemed to have lived through, a sort of protracted period of upheaval in the Caribbean, from independence to revolutions, Guyana, Grenada, political contestation in Jamaica as well. But then, after Grenada, there seems to be a sort of tapering off in terms of social upheaval in the Caribbean. And I wanted to know why is that? Why is it that in the Caribbean it seems as though our battles have been won, perhaps, or we don't feel the need to sort of organise in the same way as we used to all those years ago?
Well, I think that the one point one should make is that the collapse of the Grenada Revolution and that bloody trauma really, in a sense, destroyed the Caribbean left for a generation. So that the kind of people who had been central to this oppositional politics of the 1970s, to a greater or lesser extent, withdrew from politics. It's not true to say that this was a complete withdrawal. It's very interesting that many of the important figures who have been associated with the NGM in Grenada, for example, Chester Humphreys, who was famous for having been someone who smuggled arms into Grenada in the mid-1970s when the NGM was forming, has gone on to become a significant trade union leader and politician. And there have, of course, been significant upheavals in Trinidad around Abu Bakr. There have been small and large political protests which have been associated with violence, such as the ones which Luke talked about in Linden and Ghana. But you're absolutely right that there has not been a kind of a sense of there being a clear idea of a transformative project. And it's true to say that even within what you might call the circles of established power, there has been extraordinary slippage, which is, I think one of the big symbols of this is the dress. In the 1970s, when I grew up in the Caribbean, through the 1980s, the men, when they went to work to do jobs, whatever the job was, a white-collar job, they wore a shirt jack. What is striking is that by the late 1980s and 1990s, the collar and tie had returned as a kind of necessary symbol of operating in public life. And this kind of conservative term was associated with the neoliberal movement and the kind of demoralization of many of those who had been at the center of movements of opposition. That's a very short answer, but I think we could talk for a little longer about that.
Michael,
thank you. You partly answered what I was going to ask. I would just like to say that blacks in rebellion, slaves against slavery, provided a transformative moment for myself. Almost cathartic, in a sense. And I understand he had a great presence. Will he ever even speak publicly, or if you ever had an opportunity to speak to him? You almost felt in awe that you were almost consumed by his energy. The question I wanted to ask you is in relation to your theory regarding secondary decolonization, and whether you felt that Richard Hart believed that this had led in some way to undermine the charismatic type of hold that certain trade union leaders or political leaders had over the local population, or if and is this a continuing process, whether the secondary decolonization will continue to erode perhaps the power of the charismatic leadership, or something else emerging behind that?
I'm not aware of any text in which he specifically engaged. I think that he had a sense that we did, and to a certain extent still do have a problem with leadership, with a particular idea of leadership which is linked to forms of uncritical following on the part of those who are being led. But I have a sense that he didn't really address this in a very direct way. It is true that there are no figures in the Caribbean today with the kind of dominance which was enjoyed by Bustamante or Geary or Grant Adams in their prime. And that is a product simply of the more broken space of politics. I imagine it's something which would have caught his attention, particularly in terms of Walter Rodney's attempt to kind of experiment with a different style of political leadership. But it's not a theme which I can remember him having written or spoken about in a very focused way.
Okay, we have one last quick question from Ray.
Okay, make it short because we're very long on the time.
It's following on the same theme, but first I'd like to echo some of what has been said before about the infectious nature of Dick's participation, contribution to any discussion, is that the actual meticulous nature which he came to any subject and then shared that discovery of knowledge, always impressed and always, you were just blown away. My question is very much on the same line of the difference between charismatic leadership and cult of personality, and whether the first, in a sense, naturally, in our regional experience, naturally sort of segues into the second. Because power is a very sort of addictive tool, and none of us has shown ourselves so far to be sort of free of, the sort of benefits of power, personal benefits, group benefits, rather than looking at the national interest you know, in the course of whatever. And I know that probably was an issue that Dick would have been looking at, because he was living history, having, you know, been part of the formation of political parties, and not many of us had that direct, you know, touch with the subject.
But I think he was very interested in the organisation of the WPA in Guyana at its prime, because WPA attempted to create a structure of governance in which figures like Walter Rodney, Rugarai, Kwayana, Andaye, these were figures who were all part of the political bureau, but there was not a sort of supreme leader, and they specifically attempted to have a party which did not depend on a kind of, you know, very tight pyramid of authority. But of course that experiment was destroyed by the murder of Rodney in those years which followed 1980. I think that he continued to hope that the trade unions would provide models through which representative politics could surround and enmesh those who were charismatic leaders. I think he was interested in the OWTU, which does have in some ways a tradition of strong charismatic leadership, but also of strong systems of bureaucratic checks and balances. But we need to recognize, I suppose, that the 20th century history of the Caribbean happened very fast. And a lot of events took place in the space of 5, 10, 20 years, which were greater in terms of the pace of change than what had taken place in 200, 300 years. And that in some ways, that for all of the people involved in the political game, events were often happening faster than they could sit down and reflect on them. Maybe, in fact, for the people of the 21st century, when the wave breaks again, to learn from some of those earlier lessons.
Thank you. I think now all that remains is us to thank Richard for his presentation and for the questions and answers from you.